I argue that Arnold Toynbee's A Study of History from 1961 is the last serious scholastic attempt at universal history. Millions of words fill the 12-volume set. His views on how civilizations can be understood holistically and empirically are ultimately more correct than his most famous critic, Henry Kissinger, who views civilizations as products of rational or irrational men. The British man you will hear in this video is Mr. Toynbee, accompanied by his interviewer. Kissinger wrote his 1954 Harvard senior thesis about Toynbee, Spengler, and Kant. He is critical of Toynbee, and I'll analyze some of his thesis because of Kissinger's outsized influence in 20th century American foreign policy. It is a very complicated philosophical thesis, but I will do my best to define it. The split between Toynbee and Kissinger mirrors the split between Western society's view of itself before and after the 1960s.
How long did it take you to write it all together?
Well, it took me 27 years, because out of that came a bite of 7 years bitten out by the Second World War. But it's amusing to think of. When I'd got my notes all written out, I thought that I'd polish it off in 2 summers. It took me 27 years. You have to see current affairs in depth, and that means in the historical setting. It may take you back 10 years or 100 or several hundred sometimes. You never know what won't be relevant.
What sorts of characteristics would those be that make the difference between, say, a short and a long-lived civilization?
That brings me back to this phrase of mine, or rather Robert Browning's, challenge and response, that I think every moment of each of our individual lives and every moment in the history of a civilization, we're always being challenged by some new situation to face it and either succeed or fail. And any moment we may fail and begin to go under, or we may succeed and go on living.
Mr. Toynbee, just what is your theory of history?
Well, that's a large question. Well, I suppose I started off by finding I couldn't work with the nations as units of historical study. Most people in our time work with nations. I found them too small and felt they were somehow fragments of something bigger which I had to reach after. So I reached after civilizations. For instance, not seeing things in terms just of American history or French history or Italian history, but seeing it in terms of Western history, and then again Greek history or Indian history, and so on. These large units, about 20 of them. And then I began to study their anatomy and their life history, so to speak, and I found, as I thought, that a number of them had broken down and gone to pieces, and that had happened to them on a certain pattern. But now that didn't make me a determinist, because it didn't make me believe that is bound to happen to every civilization, such as ours, which is still alive. But I didn't end with civilizations, because when you study the breakdowns of civilizations in the past and collisions with one another, you find yourself coming to the origins of the great religions of the world: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and so on. And in these last volumes especially, I've come to the conclusion that it's really the great religions that are the ultimate patterns in history and that probably have the future. So I started with civilizations as my first key to unlock the secrets of history, if one could unlock them. And I've come on to a second key, which I think takes one further, and that's the great religions.
Seems to me that your faith in the future really belies your being described as a prophet of doom.
Well, you know, Christopher, I believe that life is action. It's action or else it's failure. I suppose that's pretty obvious in the case of practical men of action. But I'm sure it applies just as much to people like you and me, to scholars, philosophers, historians. Like the rest of us, we have to do just the best we can with the time and the energy that we have in one lifetime, and life is short. You know, during that long time when I was writing that book of mine, I heard in my mental ears 2 verses of an English poet. He wrote 300 years ago, but his words are just as much alive today. It's Andrew Marvell's lines: "But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. Therefore go to it."
I admit I've only read the first 2 volumes out of the 12 volumes here. The massive scope led to a 640-page abridgment of the work by D.C. Somerville, which I recommend to any reader who wishes to maintain their sanity. From the biography at the start of the video, Arnold Toynbee's academic and government career shows great influence in Anglo-American foreign policy between the 1920s and 1950s. Toynbee was the most popular English-language historian in the 1950s, giving many media appearances and interviews. Yet no king reigns forever. The greatest influence on Anglo-American foreign policy from the 1960s, arguably until today, is President Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger criticizes Toynbee and Spengler's worldview, but is in favor of Kant. In his sentence, Toynbee's old-school view is that civilizations have a pervasive purposiveness, which means they attempt to fulfill a conscious metaphysical purpose. Toynbee views the world as a machine capable of manipulation through a technical knowledge of the levers challenge and response, withdrawal and return, and mimesis, or social relations between people. In Kissinger's view, Toynbee sees religion and mythology as a civilization's objective external condition. Kissinger, however, is a Kantian. He affirms that man's rationality allows the self-determination to action out of a conception of the ultimacy of the moral personality, apart from any considerations of personal attachments. In the nobility of this sentiment, which Toynbee calls repulsive, the possibility of transcending the determined inexorability of phenomenal reality, the apprehension of immortality, the inward recognition of limits, expressed as tolerance, before God. I think this means that Kissinger puts individual man and man's reality as transcendent, whereas in Toynbee, man's reality is subservient to religion and mythology. This is a central dilemma of human existence. My take is that Anglo-America in Toynbee's times, the 1920s through the 1950s, projected its perceived religious tenets on the world. It created international law in the League of Nations. It created a Western moral superstructure above each state in the United Nations. Above all, the West felt bound to a moral identity larger than any one person. Toynbee's civilizations all operate in this way, above and far beyond the individual. Anglo-American foreign relations in Kissinger's times, from the 1960s through mostly the 1970s, but with a little bit of influence present until today, were centered on his private reality and morality projected onto the world. His personal view of realpolitik and détente softened relations between the United States and USSR, leading to more communication. He also opened relations with China and led negotiations that ended the Vietnam War. In a 1972 interview, he stated, quote, "I've always been convinced that I had to do whatever I've done. If I were to let myself be disturbed by reactions of the public, if I were to act solely on the basis of a calculated technique, I would accomplish nothing." Yet Kissinger is not a benevolent, rational, and moral God-man. His transcendent Kantian rationality dictated American conduct towards many smaller nations. He sanctioned or interfered in the governance of Cyprus, Israel, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Rhodesia, Portugal, Cuba, Cambodia, and many others. At the age of 100, still alive, he still exercises vastly undue influence on American foreign policy. The core question is this: if Kissinger can criticize Toynbee in favor of Kantian individual morality, can we criticize Kissinger's rationalism in favor of civilizational conscious purpose? My personal opinion is that both views are flawed, yet the story of Anglo-American civilization existed before and will exist after Henry Kissinger's influence. Its moral structure is far greater than the individual's conception of morality. I agree with Toynbee's assessment that civilizations make moral decisions based on a metaphysical foundation, even though Toynbee's empiricism is flawed at oftentimes, as Kissinger points out. We do not live in a world where all nations share a Christian metaphysical worldview, yet I put more faith in this worldview than I do in the views of a single person, no matter how rational they consider themselves to be. We live in civilizations, not in the hyper-rational plans of statesmen. Kissinger, as a technocrat, may have larger influence on American civilization during his lifetime, but this is not supreme. The Anglo-American civilization will eventually crumble to dust, and its purposiveness, or its conscious mission, will be remembered long after the ideas of its most famous men. In our day, while we know each individual Roman emperor, we are far more aware of the Roman Empire as a civilizational force. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments or feedback, please let me know below. There have been many thoughtful comments left on my video for the size of my channel, so to everybody that's commented, I'm sorry that I haven't replied to you, especially if you have direct questions or feedback to me. It's still something I'm working on, the whole YouTube content creator presence thing. And I would also say thank you to the almost 350 subscribers that I have now. The channel has grown a lot, and I thank all of you for your continued viewership.